We're continuing on Hilchot Shabbat in our journey through Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. We're up to Seif, Siman Resh Tzadi, Seif Bet, the halachot of Me'ah Brachot, saying 100 Brachot, and also taking naps on Shabbat. So we mentioned that the Shulchan Aruch already gives us the green light to add some Brachot, even when there is question of maybe getting into a Safek Bracha. We discussed the details of adding Brachot on Shabbat to make sure that we have our obligation met of making 100 Brachot every day. We are short on Shabbat because of the Tefillah that's not 19 Brachot, rather it is only 7 Brachot each one of the Shemona Esrei, and therefore a deliberate attempt should be made to make sure that we make 100 brachot. Now, the Rama adds here, that if you are used to taking a Shabbat nap, you should not necessarily do away with it, because it's considered part of your Oneg Shabbat. It's part of the Oneg Shabbat to be able to take a little nap if you are used to it. Now, obviously you don't want to overdo it either. It shouldn't be that you go have Sudat Shabbat, Leil Shabbat, you go to sleep, you wake up in the morning, and then you daven, you eat Suda, and then you sleep again until Minha. That should not be necessarily the schedule. It's Chaval, as we'll see in Seif Bet. It's very important to learn Torah on Shabbat, right? Even Talmidei Chachamim who are learning the entire day, every day of the week, still it's mitzvah for them to learn, even though that for them it's a bigger inyan to rest on Shabbat as well. But nevertheless, they should be learning as well. The Ben Ish Chai brings that learning Torah on Shabbat is 1,000 times more valuable than learning Torah during the week. So, in other words, if you want to put that into a little perspective, you learn 1 hour. 1 hour of learning Torah on Shabbat is 1,000 hours, which means almost 40 days of consecutive hours of learning. Only with 1 hour of learning on Shabbat. It's a tremendous thing. Now, the Ari HaKadosh, Maharchu brings, Reb Chaim Vital brings from his Rebbe, the Ari HaKadosh in Sha'ar HaKavanot, that it is important for a person to have rest on Shabbat. It says, taking a Shenat Sahoraim, having a afternoon nap on weekdays is not a good thing. But having a little nap on Shabbat is important. And he says, Ari HaKadosh himself had a 2-hour nap, 3-hour nap on Shabbat afternoon to rejuvenate. Obviously, Ari HaKadosh, even when he was taking a nap, he was connected with the source of learning Torah and so on. There are stories about him discussing his level of elevation during the naps that he had on Shabbat with his student, the Maharchu. But nevertheless, it is applied by the Maharchu, by Reb Chaim Vital himself, to every layman as well, that the person taking a little nap on Shabbat is a positive thing. Obviously, it should not be misused, as we mentioned before. Should not be wasting the entire Shabbat with eating and sleeping only. But again, halachically speaking, a person should not be putting himself into a difficult situation, even with learning Be'iyun. The Yabetz writes in his Sidur that you want to learn things that are gishmak on Shabbat, things that give you oneg Shabbat, and therefore a person should be mindful of all of that. Says Shulchan Aruch in Seif Bet, Achar Seudat Shacharit kovim midrash likro b'nevi'im v'lidrosh b'divrei Agada. After the Seudah of Shabbat, the Batei Midrash is full. People go back after Seudah to learn. They are going to be starim, shiur in Divrei Agada and in Nevi'im. Ve'asur likboa Seudah b'ota sha'ah. And you should not be eating anymore. And Shabbat afternoon is a time for learning. Especially laymen who are not learning enough during the course of the week. Shabbat is your time. Ya'asku yoter b'Torah b'Shabbat. their time of learning and dedicating themselves to the learning of Torah is on Shabbat. More so than Talmidei Chachamim, Haoskim b'Torah, more so than the Talmidei Chachamim, that the entire week also they're toiling and working hard and learning Kol Yemei HaShavua. והתלמידי חכמים ימשיכו יותר בעונג אכילה ושתייה קצת. תלמידי חכמים should spend a little more time spending time with the family. Again, Talmidei Chachamim were not available. They were learning 18, 19 hours a day. Most of them were out of town, not with their families, like literally putting a whole day on learning. And that's something that people nowadays may or may not relate to, but a real dedication to mastering all areas of Torah was something that they did with Mesirut Nefesh, with tremendous self-sacrifice. If you study the Gemara in Masechet Ketuvot, Daf Sabach Gimel, you see they would go out of town sometimes for years at a time, away from the family, to dedicate themselves completely to mastering of the Torah. So if that's the situation, on Shabbat they should be a little bit more focused on family and on Onek Shabbat. They are busy with learning the entire rest of the week. That being said, the Mishna Berura says, the Ita b'Midrash, Abra Torah lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why is it that we learn, communal learnings are set up on Shabbat afternoons? Because the Midrash says HaKadosh Baruch Hu heard a complaint from the day of Shabbat, Ribono Shel Olam. Right? The Torah came in front of Hashem complaining. In the 40 years of the Midbar, of the wilderness, everyone was learning Torah the whole day. And the Torah complained in front of Hashem, says, now they're going to go to Eretz Yisrael. Ish al machaneu, ish al diglo. Everyone is going to be tachat te'enato, tachat zeto. Everyone is going to be busy with their field and their business. Ani matei alai. What's going to be with me? Who's going to learn Torah? Amar la, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells the Torah, Yesh li zug sha'ani mezaveg lach. He says, I have a ben zug for you. I have a shidduch. Shabbat shemo. Shabbat is its name. Shehem betelim b'melachtam. They can't work, and they're going to be learning Torah. Ve'cholin la'asok bach. The Yerushalmi says the same thing. Amar Rabun. The Yerushalmi says the reason that on regular days of the Chol HaMoed is asur to work is because Chazal wanted us to not have to work and be able to study Torah, to dedicate ourselves to the learning of the Torah. So Yamim Tovim, Shabbatot, and Chol HaMoed are days that we learn Torah. The Shnat HaShvi'it, the whole year out of 7 years, is a time that people are not working their fields. Again, remember, until 100 years ago, 98% of the business was the agricultural system. So you had an entire country not working and learning Torah. That dedication to the Torah is something that the Torah has set up itself, set up us the community for success. Nowadays, unfortunately, we don't have that Shvi'it, but at least the Shabbatot and Yamim Tovim should be definitely dedicated to the learning of the Torah. V'litrosh, this that the shiurim of Divrei Haggadah, העיקר יהיה אז ללמד לרבים את חוקי האלוקים ואת תורותיו. Says the Chafetz Chaim, the ikar has to be the Hilchot Shabbat. You should be learning Hilchot Shabbat, what's asur, what's mutar, and obviously the Rav has to be creative enough to mix it with Divrei Haggadah. They should be pleasant to listen to. It should be moshechet halev. Hamadrichim et ha'adam liyirat shamayim. Also give you the Divrei Haggadah, give a person yirat shamayim. Like the Yalkut says in the beginning of Parashat Vayakhel, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe Rabbeinu, you should have kehilot gedolot on Shabbat. People should gather and you should teach them Hilchot Shabbat. Leorot Yisrael Isur veheter. V'lo kemo shenagin achshav, says the Bach, Magen Avraham, says there shouldn't be like nowadays that you're doing iyud and other things. It should be practical things that people could take home that adds to the Yirat Shamayim and the knowledge of the basic halachot of what's asur, what is mutar. That's the important thing. Asur likva seuda, the Gemara says, there are three reasons that Baalei Batim lose their wealth, right? The segula for parnasa you want, this is what the Gemara says. Gemara says, you know why people lose their wealth? For three different reasons. And one of them is the kav iseuda b'shabbata beidan b'midrasha, because they extend their seuda on Shabbat in the time that they should be learning. Shabbat afternoon is meant for learning. You eat quickly, you say benching, you say some singing with the family, spend some time with the kids, you bench, you run to the Bet Midrash. That's the Shabbat afternoon schedule. And it's not something to keep for yourself. You have to tell your friends also, what are you doing Shabbat afternoon? Sleeping? Okay, so you take a little nap, you take a little rest, and you run to the Bet Midrash to learn a little bit before Mincha of Shabbat. The learning on Shabbat afternoon is something extraordinary and super important. And this is something that's brought in Yerushalmi also in Siman, but Yosef brings it in Siman Hashbe'achet. לא ניתנו שבתות וימים טובים לישראל אלא כדי לעסוק בהם בתורה. Shabbat and Yom Tov is given to us in order to be able to learn Torah. The reason of the Isur Melacha is to be able to learn Torah. Actually, the Sefer Chinuch asks this question. Sefer Chinuch is one of the Gedolei HaRishonim. He says, on Shabbat, I understand why we don't work. Right? Kibor Shabbat, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu made Shabbat, he didn't, so to speak, work. He stopped the creation, so we stop from Melacha. Fine. Yom Tov, you want to eat and drink and be happy? Fine. But why Isur Melacha? Why can't I cook? Why? Well, cooking you could do, Ochel Nefesh. Why can't I drive on Yom Tov to the shul? Why? It's not like Shabbat that Hashem stopped the Melacha, that you have to also stop the Melacha. There's absolutely no reason for Isur Melacha on Yom Tov. Says the Chinuch. The reason there is Isur Melacha is Hashem wants you not to be able to be involved in any mundane worldly activities in order to spend the time learning Torah, in order to spend the time with the family and with the Torah. So that is what we're learning over here as well. The Shabbat afternoon is really a time dedicated to learning. Ela yaktim ota. You do Suda earlier, later, but Shabbat afternoon is for learning Torah. Says the Chafetz Chaim, let me vent to you. This is a musar. People who go on strolls, schmoozing the corners of the streets, and so on. That's not what it was intended for. That's Bitul Torah. Ki afilu seudat Shabbat she mitzvah. Even seudat Shabbat, that's a mitzvah. It's asur on that time. Mipnei bitul Torah, because of bitul Torah. Kol sheken letayel ulaharbot as besicha betelas. Certainly, it would be a isur to just waste the time by schmoozing and strolling the streets, and therefore it's something important to keep in mind as well. That Shabbat afternoons are time for dedicating ourselves, our families, our children to Talmud Torah. So says the one last piece over here. Says the Mishna Berura, the Talmidei Chachamim, that they learn the rest of the week. One last piece for the Mishna Berura before we go to that. He says, especially לאיזה אנשים שמזרזים לעולם בשבת בקיץ, אף שעוד היום גדול להתפלל מנחה ולקיים סעודה שלישית, וגורמים שכל אנשי בית המדרש יפסיקו מלימודם. It says Shabbat afternoons in the summertime, that the days are longer. A person shouldn't necessarily start Suda Shlishi too early either, because again, you're taking away time from the Beit Midrash, from the people learning. You do the minimum that's necessary, and the rest of the time, Shabbat afternoon, should be dedicated to learning Torah, even during the longer hours of Shabbat afternoon in the summer Zman, in the summertime, which you have a long afternoon. All of it should be really dedicated to learning and not stopping it for an early Seudah Shlishit either. Fine. So that's really the conclusion of our Siman over here. Siman Resh Sadi. Siman Resh Sadi Aleph speaks about the halachot of Seudah Shlishit. So we spoke about this before, that we are obligated really to have 3 Seudot on Shabbat. The first 2 are a full obligation. The third one, the Seudah of Shabbat afternoon, even though that Shabbat afternoon is the highest level of Kedusha of Shabbat, but the third Seudah is debatable in the Rishonim if it's a full-fledged obligation, and the Shulchan Aruch takes side in that. Shulchan Aruch says it is an obligation. A person should have Seudah Shlishit on Shabbat, but because of the machloket surrounding it, if you missed, for instance, saying Retzeh, if you forgot to say Retzeh in Birkat Hamazon, you don't go back and bench again. Whereas in the first 2 Seudot of Shabbat, Leil Shabbat, the Friday night, and Shabbat morning Seudah, if you missed Retzeh, you have to bench again. So says the Shulchan Aruch, Yeheh zahir me'od lekayem Seudat Shlishit. You have to be very careful to have a proper Seudah Shlishit. Ve'af im hu saveh, even if you are full, yachol lekayem otah bekabetzah. You could have a minimum amount of bread, a kabetzah bread. Ve'ef shar lo kol klalech, or if you can't eat at all, so then you're not obligated to pale yourself with forcing the food down your throat. But says the Shulchan Aruch, if you're wise, you have to see the future and plan accordingly. Don't overeat in the Seudah of morning. Don't eat Seudah of morning too late or too much. And this way, you're planning ahead of the time, to have room, to have appetite for Seudah Shlishit. If you did not eat Friday night Seudah, then you should be eating 3 Seudot during the day, to make sure that you have 3 Seudot on Shabbat. This is what the Rosh says in Masechet Pesachim, and that's the halacha. Now, the Gemara says, "Chayav adam le'echol 3 seudot b'Shabbat." A person is obligated to eat 3 seudot on Shabbat, right? And the Gemara uses even a pasuk to support this. Vayomer Moshe ichlu hayom ki Shabbat hayom laHashem hayom lo timtza'u b'sadeh. It says hayom 3 times when he talks about eating, that today has to be 3 seudot. And Chazal say, "Kol ha'mekayem 3 seudot b'Shabbat nitzol b3 pur'aniyot." A person that eats 3 seudot on Shabbat, he saves himself from 3 different catastrophes. Chevlo shel Mashiach, from the Yisurim, that's going to be the time of Mashiach, Dila shel Geinam, and Milchemet Gog uMagog. From Geinam and from Milchemet Gog uMagog, the eventual battle right prior to the coming of the Mashiach. Shneimar, the pasuk, the Gemara brings the support for all of this. Ve'af la'ani ha'over mimakom l'makom. Even a poor person, sarich litel lo kol 3 seudot b'Shabbat. When he asks for tzedakah, the gabbai tzedakah from Tamchu, he gives him not just 2 seudot, but 3 seudot worth of money or food for his entire Shabbat's seudah. We learned this in Hilchot Tzedakah. We have discussed this in the beginning of Hilchot Shabbat as well, and you could do it with minimum of kabetzah. Says the Mishna Berura, lav dafka kabetzah. You could even have a little more than kabetzah. You have to have, because kabetzah is still achilat arai. So you want to eat a little bit more than kabetzah. Chosh katuv sof siman resh lamed bet, and it's not considered seudah less than that. Yesh omrim, but there are those who say afilu kazayit yotzei yedei chova seudah. that even with a kazayit, you're yotze seuda. So lechatchila, a person should be machmir to the kametzah. If you mamash can't, do at least a kazayit, and you could then bench and have fulfilled the mitzvah of seuda shlishit as well. So that basically concludes the first Seif over here. We're out of time. We're going to continue Be'ezrat Hashem the next Seif in the days to come. Hazak Baruch.